We did take every reasonable precaution in disguising the real-life identities of the people involved in that story.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Behavioral Arts. My name is Spidey, and I use my degree in sociology and psychology, my certifications in criminal interrogation and body language analysis, and over 10 years' experience as an award-winning mentalist to teach people behavioral analysis and practical psychology on stages and television shows all over the world. The Netflix original hit series Baby Reindeer continues to grow in popularity while viewers from all over the world are trying to figure out where does the true story end and fiction begin. Last week on this channel, I did an analysis of Piers Morgan's interview with Fiona Harvey, the woman who's the real-life inspiration behind the stalker character Martha. Since that interview, there have been some pretty serious developments, including an inquiry by the Scottish National Party requesting evidence from Netflix about some of the allegations in the show. Fiona Harvey, who's threatening to sue Netflix for defamation, has also released an official statement to the media further elaborating her position on the whole story. So this video is going to be a follow-up to last week's analysis. We're going to talk about some of these developments and see what they contribute to our conclusions, but I'm also going to address some of the comments you guys had, particularly when it comes to a very strange comment she made during the interview, and you guys had some awesome things to say about that. We're also going to be talking to a very good friend of mine who's a lawyer to clarify some of the misconceptions I'm seeing in the comments, particularly when it comes to what constitutes defamation and has Netflix fully protected themselves. Let's dive right in. So let's start with this whole Scottish National Party MP and what's going on there. So on May 8th, in front of the House of Commons Culture, Media and Sports Committee, Benjamin King, who's Netflix's Senior UK Director of Public Policy, made an appearance, addressed the committee, and when asked about the accuracy of Baby Reindeer and what measures they took to protect the identity of the individuals at play, he said this.
Baby Reindeer is an extraordinary story, and it is obviously a true story of the horrific abuse that the writer and protagonist Richard Gadd suffered at the hands of a convicted stalker. We did take every reasonable precaution in disguising the real-life identities of the people involved in that story in the making of the show.
She's been identified,
whilst also striking a balance with the veracity and authenticity of Richard's story.
Okay, really quickly, in terms of body language and more importantly word choice, we see someone who's speaking very coherently, but there are certain things that suggest a lack of confidence, especially towards that second part, when he's talking about the measures they took to protect the identities of the people involved. If we look at his hands, we're on the table like this, fingers crossed in together like this. As he starts to talk about the measures they took to protect identities, we start to see a lot more pacifiers and or adapters. This is what the research calls gestures that we use to soothe ourselves in moments of stress. So it's any massage type gesture that helps us kind of soothe that stress. Now it's happening a lot before that moment, but it starts to spike in that moment. Another thing that spikes is, although we're hearing a bit of ums in the beginning, he really starts to fall apart with that answer. We hear a lot of what we call verbal leaks, this kind of stuff, like these filler words. He's also stammering quite a bit more. As he's talking, he says of the people involved in the making of the show. So it's taking a little bit more time to get those words out, and he's choosing those words very carefully. At some point, the gentleman who's talking to him also interjects with a question, and he kind of bulldozes through it to finish his prepared statement because he just wants to get to the end of his point.
Real life identities of the people involved in that story in the making of the show.
She's been identified,
whilst also striking a balance with the veracity and authenticity of Richard's story.
But leaving behavioral analysis aside, if you ask me the very simple question, was this gentleman deceptive in front of this committee? The answer is yes, because he said that they took every reasonable precaution to disguise the identities of the individuals in the show, but they didn't. Fans of the show were able to very quickly put together who the character Martha was based on after the release of the show, and with good reason. For one thing, they took tweets that Fiona had posted and almost verbatim put them in the show. They also referenced specific details from her life, like the fact that she was in the news for having stalked a former MP and his wife. And also, they hired an actress, Jessica Gunning, who is an amazing actress, but she's English. And they made her put on a Scottish accent to represent Fiona, who in real life is Scottish. For the story, it didn't need that. Jessica could have just had her normal accent or any other accent, but the fact that We now know this is a Scottish woman who had this kind of stuff in the news about her, who wrote these kinds of tweets. It was very easy to find out who she was, so Netflix did not do everything to reasonably protect her identity. By the way, just to clarify, I'm not arguing that they should or should not protect her identity. There's a lot of people online saying she did all these things, she was a stalker, she should live by her actions, and that's a reasonable way to think about this. The only argument I'm making is that in front of that committee, when Benjamin King said that they did everything to protect the identity of some of these individuals, it doesn't appear to be the case. But what he said in the first part of his statement really caught my interest, because there's been a lot of debate as to whether the part where she was convicted is a true story. And Richard Gadd made some statements, and Netflix made some statements, and we're going to look at all of those. But during this hearing, he says that Baby Reindeer is obviously a true story. And I find that adjective interesting. Obviously. It's not that obvious to me. I mean, we don't know what really happened. So obviously a true story of a convicted stalker.
And it is obviously a true story of the horrific abuse that the writer and protagonist Richard Gadd suffered at the hands of a convicted stalker.
This is during an official hearing, under oath. He's saying convicted stalker. Now, the MP who was asking him these questions wasn't quite convinced of some of these answers. So he sent Benjamin King an official letter requesting more evidence, especially because in all this time, nobody's been able to produce evidence that she was at any point convicted of these things, a claim that she denies very passionately. In fact, that was one of the main focuses of my analysis of her interview with Piers Morgan. If we look at the interview as a whole, whenever she denies most things, there are little caveats, little ands, ifs, or buts. Her story changes a little. Later on, she'll answer it a different way. But when it came to that jail scene, there seemed to be nothing but confidence. She very confidently denied that she hadn't been convicted, hadn't been to court, hadn't been tried, hadn't been found guilty, and has never gone to jail.
Did you go to jail? Did you have a
No,
trial?
of course not. Of course not.
Have you ever been to prison?
No.
Have you ever been charged with a
Nowhere
criminal
near it.
offence?
No.
Never?
No.
Nothing?
Nothing.
So that scene is completely invented.
That's completely false.
So in looking at her absolute confidence in that denial compared to other denials in the interview, I was rather convinced that that part may have been an exaggeration in the series, especially because Richard Gadd, the creator himself, had said that some elements had been tweaked for dramatic climaxes. I also 100% accepted that I could be wrong about that it could be that all that happened, but there was something about her denial that was a lot more confident than other things. Well, now it seems like she's doubling down on the confidence when it comes to that specific element. Now, before we talk about how she's doubling down on that specific scene, I want to talk about this epiphany that I had that I wrote in the comments, but I want to talk about on the video as well. So while I was watching that scene, it hit me that in the series, she pleads guilty. The character of Martha pleads guilty to all the stalking charges.
Are you guilty or not guilty?
Guilty? A little reindeer.
And if we look at Fiona Harvey in that interview with Piers Morgan, one of the common themes of her responses is deflecting. Nothing's ever her fault. When she's asked about stalking the MP's family, she completely denies it. When she's told that she was fired from that job, she says, no, I quit. Nothing's ever her fault. She's always deflecting in any way she can. So for me, as I was editing, it clicked that it's very unlikely that a woman like this would plead guilty. It seems very off character. So that just added for me a little bit more to the belief that that scene was fictional or tweaked at the very least. Now we're going to talk about what Richard Gadd had to say about that specific scene, but just this week, Fiona Harvey released an official statement to the media, and I think she wrote this with some legal counsel, and in that statement, she had this to say. I have no doubt that the character of Martha in Baby Reindeer was intended to be a portrayal of me. The problem for Richard Gadd, and now for Netflix, is that Baby Reindeer is not a true story at all. I am not a convicted stalker, in quotes. I have never been charged with any crime, let alone been convicted, still less pled guilty, and of course I have never been to prison for anything. This is how Gadd and Netflix chose to portray me in a TV show for their own financial gain. This statement, to me, solidifies so much last week's analysis because of all the things in the show that she could have included in this letter. This didn't happen, that didn't happen, I didn't write all those letters, I didn't tweet that often. This is the specific thing that she's choosing to focus on. She's saying these are the things that didn't happen. She keeps going back to that court scene the way she did in her interview with Piers Morgan. And again, it has been reported that she is talking to lawyers. So I think it's very likely that her lawyers helped her draft this and said, listen, you're gonna have to give up some of the ambiguous stuff, like the messages, the emails, the letters. Give that up, stick to the things that for sure aren't true. And I think under their advisement, we came back to this, the convictions and her going to jail. Okay, so we have Netflix representatives saying that this element is true. We have Fiona Harvey denying this specific element. Where does Richard Gadd stand? Richard being, of course, the creator of the show and the lead actor in the Netflix series. So something really unusual happened. In my analysis video, in the comments, a few commenters said that in an interview, Richard said that that specific part, the court scene, was made up. It wasn't true. And this was really unusual for me because I'd watched some interviews of him and I hadn't seen him say that or talk about that specific scene. The other thing that was really unusual is that of all the comments that I saw saying that, not one of them gave a source. Not one said, in this specific interview, he said that. Or here's an interview where he said this and gave a quote. They were all very ambiguous, saying Richard Gadd has said that the court scene was not true. Now, in my experience, when that kind of thing happens, when a lot of commenters are saying the same very strong concrete fact, but there isn't a source, or when I ask, I don't really get a response, it usually indicates that someone, somewhere, whether it's a YouTuber or a blogger or some comment somewhere that got a lot of traction, said that statement without giving a source, and all these people saw that and decided to run with it. That's normally how this type of thing happens. Now, I'm not saying that's for sure what it is. It's just a feeling I had, but I got a lot more clarity when I had the pleasure of replying to a commenter whose YouTube name is Airflow to the Turbo, because this person started by making that same statement, that Richard has come out and said that the court scene was not real. This person's comment started more or less along the lines as the other ones I was talking about, in claiming that Richard Gadd, in several interviews, has said that the court scene was fictional. And I replied asking for a source. I was genuinely curious and excited because it would confirm my suspicions about the court scene. But when this commenter was kind enough to look into this statement to back up what they commented, they found out that this was actually a big exaggeration, that someone had commented this on the Piers Morgan interview without giving a source, and a whole bunch of people were just running with that. They also said that this comment is referencing one interview that Richard Gadd did and made a comment about jail in general. And the comment he made was this: I felt a great deal of empathy for the real-life Martha. I didn't want to throw someone who was that level of mentally unwell in prison. Now, to me, that's not a flat-out denial. This is a statement on what a person wants, not what happened. They're not saying she never went to prison, she was never convicted, I never sued her, I never went to the police. He's not saying that. He's saying, I didn't want to throw someone like that in prison. Although I do see that he could mean here that she didn't actually go to prison. I can also see this meaning that she did get in trouble with the law, he just didn't want to see her go to prison. But it certainly isn't him saying, we made that scene up, that did not happen. That's a massive assumption. Speaking of assumptions, I'm assuming that this is the article that people are referencing when they say that he denied the jail scene being real. But I don't know. Maybe there is another interview that he did that I missed. I feel like I really looked for this information when some people commented that and I didn't find anything. And anyone who responded to my questions about this brought up this specific interview. But please, 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 if there's another interview where he flat out came out and said, we made that up, it's fiction, that didn't happen, I would love to see that. So let me know in the comments where I could find it. By the way, while we're on the subject, most commenters were just trying to contribute to the conversation and had read something that may not be true. But in most cases, it was very polite or neutral. However, one commenter by the name of Nom de Plume 2213 decided to say this: I could have saved you a lot of time, LOL. Richard Gadd himself says that part of the show was fictionalized. The courtroom scene is completely fake, and he says so in every all caps interview. Then they go on to say a bunch of condescending and rude things. This comment is such a great example of how polarized and absolute statements can strip your credibility just like that. Because if the person had said that Richard Gadd said this in an interview or in some interviews instead of every interview, it would be much harder to disprove. But when you say every, All it takes is one counterexample. Now, although I have a lot of counterexamples to choose from, a really great one is his appearance on This Morning, which is one of the most viewed interviews about the show. And in that interview, he never mentions the court scene, and he certainly doesn't say that it was fictionalized, thus inadvertently stripping Nom de Plume 2213 of any credibility. Look, I don't really understand comments like that. I'm trying to build a community here. I see you guys as my YouTube family, and very often in the comments, there's a lot of information coming in that helps us get to the bottom of things extremely effectively. And if someone has information that can contribute to the conversation, come in, let us know. We'd all love to read it. But to come in with this condescending attitude, knocking people down, especially when the point you're making is easily disprovable and based on false information, that doesn't make any sense to me. Now, that being said, Nom de Plume 2213 did contribute something else to this conversation, although they are very polarized about the implication of it, classic Nom de Plume. They did bring up that Netflix, at the end of every episode, at the end of the credits, did say that some of the details were changed for dramatic purposes. So I had a question about this. Despite the fact that in the beginning it says, this is a true story, despite the fact there are articles on the Netflix website saying it's a true story, that there are representatives of Netflix going in front of committees and saying that it's a true story, is that little disclaimer at the end enough to say, no, we said it, it's not defamation. That statement was there. Is that enough? So I wanted to talk to someone who would definitely know the answer, and so I brought in a special guest to talk about the legal implications of all this ambiguity. My special guest today to talk about the legality of this entire situation is someone who doesn't need an introduction to my regular viewers. You'll remember her from the time we were covering Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard, where she was super kind and gracious and welcomed me on her channel and made a few appearances on this channel. She is a legal commentator on YouTube. She has an amazing channel where she comments on popular trials. It's Alita from Legal Bytes.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me on, Spidey.
I am so excited to talk about this with you because even outside of this, we've been talking, you and me, about how crazy a lot of these elements are, and I'm so excited for the viewers to hear it from you. Alita, I wanted to start with a question that I feel we should talk about just for everyone to understand what's at stake here, from a very basic level. So what is defamation, and what does one need to prove to show that defamation is taking place?
So it can definitely depend on whether we're talking about defamation in the United States versus defamation in the UK. Folks that are very familiar with the Depp v. Heard case probably understand that very well, seeing as there were two trials that happened with two very different outcomes. But generally speaking, the overarching connection between the two is the basic definition of defamation, which is essentially where the plaintiff says that the defendant has made some sort of a statement to a third party about the plaintiff or referencing the plaintiff that is false or misleading to the extent that the plaintiff has suffered some reputational harm.
Great. And I think that in this case, there's definitely some of that going on. But I would imagine that Netflix is going to come out and say, now, hold on, at the end of every episode, all the way at the end of the credits, we put up a message that states, this program is based on real events. However, certain characters, names, incidents, locations, and dialogue have been fictionalized for dramatic purposes. So, Alita, my question to you is, they have that statement at the end. In the beginning, it says, this is a true story. Which one carries more weight? And does that statement at the end basically cover their bums to where they could do whatever they want to do?
Well, what you have here are two conflicting messages essentially from Netflix, right? There's the statement at the very beginning that says this is a true story. And then there's the one at the end that is sort of this boilerplate kind of things have been changed to be fictionalized for dramatic purposes. But what courts are going to be looking at is what a reasonable viewer is going to interpret from this overall context, from the beginning to the end. And part of that is going to be an analysis of how the average Netflix viewer consumes the show. So, when you watch a show on Netflix, very often people will binge it from one to the next, and oftentimes it'll skip right through the credits on to the next one. So an analysis will also have to include how many folks are watching those opening credits, which has that very strong statement of this is a true story, versus how many of them are watching all the way through to the end credits, where they're able to see that last little disclaimer at the end that kind of softens that. Another part of this is, a question would probably be asked, what is Netflix, thinking? What's their motivation for putting such a bold statement at the very beginning? The purpose of it is for dramatic effect. It's because they want to have this sort of drama from the very beginning where the viewer first sees the statement, this is a true story. And then the story that actually unfolds is one that is absolutely wackadoodle insane. And so and all of that gets tied back to that first statement of like, wow, this actually happened. These are real people. So it's really hard to then at the very end kind of like sort of tie that up and be like, well, actually, we didn't actually mean it. We didn't really mean it. It's not really, really real. But there are some things that have maybe been changed, a few things here and there for dramatic effect. But it's also not clear how much of those changes were changes that were material things that the plaintiff would care about, things that the viewer would care about, or are they like small little distinctions without a difference?
Beautifully said. And I think we're seeing the manifestation of what you just explained in the real world, because if you look at the response to this, sure, there are some people who are saying, no, hold on. If you wait till the end, it says that. And then even the creator of the show, Richard Gadd, on some interviews said that some of the things were tweaked for fiction. So some people are aware of that, but a whole bunch of other people are looking at those words in the beginning and they're taking the show for face value and are very much defending that these things happened in the way that they happened, because they're committed to it, right? They got so sucked into the show that they really need to believe that these things happen. You even look at interviewers like Piers Morgan, who has researchers on his team, and even they seem to not be aware that there were certain conversations from the creator who said that certain things were tweaked. Let me ask you this. On the Netflix app, at the very least, which is where I checked, under genres, nowhere does it say documentary or in any way suggests that the genre here is real. In fact, the first thing it says is TV drama. So is that in any way an out, or does that in any way cover them to say, we never presented this as a documentary? Or does it come down to the same thing?
I think it really comes down to some very similar things. There have been other cases where people or entities have sued for defamation for a work of fiction that is based off of real events. One example of that is the movie The Laundromat, which was based off of the Panama Papers, the law firm that was involved in the Panama Papers and who was portrayed in the movie actually did sue Netflix for it, but Netflix won. But it's an interesting argument because it's kind of it feels a little bit similar in some ways, even though there might be some differences that could make a difference as to who would win in this particular case.
Got it. That makes perfect sense. And again, there's so much kind of gray area here, because there was even a hearing in Parliament in the UK, and a Netflix representative went and flat out said that this is a true story. And they're asking Netflix now to provide evidence for certain things. So it seems that even in Parliament, there are certain people who are going, this was really represented as a true thing, and you seem to be sticking by that. We're going to need to see some evidence. So we are definitely seeing this lean a little bit more towards the middle, whereas the one you just named seems to be like Netflix was a little bit safer.
Yeah. Yeah, and the disclaimers were different in that case. They actually said that it was based off of a true story, or based off, as opposed to saying this is a true story, which can make all the difference.
And defending it in Parliament, in continuing
Yes.
to say this is a true story. And even in their press release or on the Netflix website, there was kind of like an interview that announced the whole thing, and it very strongly states on their website, this is a true story. So there's a lot of places where, yeah, there are locations where if you really look into it, it goes the other way, but there are places where they seem to be really sticking to those guns. Let me ask you one last question here. Is there a burden of responsibility on them to hide the identity of the actual individual? And will that play into the legality of this? Like, had they been a little bit more meticulous and kind of giving her a different nationality, for example, because in this case, they're like, she's Scottish, and then putting up some tweets that people could just go and easily find her. Would this be more defendable if they had been more cautious? Because they claim, we did everything we can to hide the identity. I don't think they did. would there be more of a defense if they had hid her identity better?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think so, because one thing that I did look up with UK law is the aspect of identifying the claimant. I mean, just looking at my notes, it's an objective test in the UK. So what they ask is, in order to identify a claimant, it doesn't have to be something that the person is expressly identified. The question is, would a reasonable person have understood the words to refer to the claimant? So whether the publisher intended for them to be identified has no bearing in that whatsoever. So, again, it comes down to a reasonable person and what they would believe. If they had changed enough about this character to sort of conceal her, then, a reasonable person would have maybe been looking in some other directions for, figuring out who this person is. Then, there would have been a bit more of, you could say, a bit more of a burden on her with stepping forward and confirming that she is the person.
Wow, beautifully said. And I think this is where things are getting a little clearer for me, because it was very easy for people to identify her. There was enough there for people to very quickly find her. It took a matter of days for people to be like, oh, there she is. I guess the bottom line for you, Alita, is, does Fiona Harvey have a case here?
I think, it depends on how much truth there is to the statements. And that, I think, is something that is still relatively unclear. And that's one of the reasons why I think there's been so much interest in finding her and finding out her background. But in any defamation case, generally speaking, at least in the US anyway, truth is always considered an absolute defense. You can't be misrepresenting someone with something that is the truth. So if it turns out that all of the things that they've portrayed in this show actually did occur and actually are real, then she's got no case. But if there are things that they took some liberties with, in a direction that is actually more damaging to her reputation, then yeah, she certainly would have a case, at the very least, to open up a case.
Wow, thank you so much for all that, Alita. It really, really helps clarify certain things, because a lot of people were saying, well, they put that sign at the end, so it's all fine, they're protected. But there's a lot more nuance than that, and I'm really thankful that you were here to shed some light on that nuance. So thanks so much for that.
Of course, thanks for having me.
So there it is. Despite the fact that at the end of every episode, there was that sentence that said that some stuff are dramatized for effect, it's still reasonable, and we're seeing it out in the real world, that people are really thinking that a lot of these details are real, that no one has come out and specifically said, okay, this thing about her is not real, especially when they made it very easy to find the person it was based on. There was one other thing from the analysis that was really bothering me, and your comments really helped me figure it out, and I'm very thankful. A lot of you chimed in on this. We had some great conversations, and I think I kind of figured it out, but it creates a whole new problem. So in your interview with Piers Morgan, Fiona Harvey said this about the title of the show.
It says that you told Richard Gadd that he looked like a baby reindeer toy you once had as a child, hence the name of the show.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I appear to have written most of the show in my sleep. I dressed.
So Fiona said, I appear to have written most of the show in my sleep. And that confused me, because as I said in the analysis, here in Canada or in the US, when you say you could do something in your sleep, it means it's really easy. So I was wondering if it meant something else in the UK. So first of all, thanks for all the commenters from the UK who said, no, pretty much means the same thing here. But I did ask you guys to let me know what you think it could mean. And of all the answers, there's one that came up the most and makes the most sense to me. And it's the fact that she's saying, because so many elements in the show are based on her, like the title, Baby Reindeer, she appears to have written this show without trying. So in her sleep, meaning she didn't consciously contribute to this show, but they took so much from her that she appears to have written it without even trying. And I really like that answer. I think that's exactly what she means, because she goes on to say, to conclude that thought, she says that she inadvertently gave the show its title. So she's kind of echoing that same sentiment that she just gave all these elements to the show. The reason my mind had a hard time accepting that initially is because in saying that, she's confirming that a lot of the show is accurate, right? And that's where it didn't click for me. On Piers Morgan, a lot of the time she's spending trying to say, this isn't true, that's not true, almost nothing is true. But now you're claiming that you wrote the show. That's how much of it is true. So to me, it's that conflict that was like, wait, Why would she say that if she's also denying the show being true? Also, she said in the interview very clearly that she has not watched the show. So then how could she possibly know that she wrote elements of it in her sleep? So again, there's such a contradiction to what this sentence probably means that I had a hard time accepting that she was just saying that. Speaking of her not watching the show, there's something I said in the analysis, and a few commenters said something about that I just want to clarify. So in the interview, she said that she has not watched the show, she only heard about a few elements of it. However, anytime Piers referenced anything that happened in the show, she didn't need any clarification. She knew exactly what he was talking about. There was never a point where she said, oh wait, was that in the show? How did that happen? Oh, okay, yeah, no, here's what actually happened. There was never a moment like that. She was always aware of exactly what he was talking about. And so I said only one of two things is possible. One, she's seen the show, or two, she's had a lot more than one conversation. She's had a lot of conversations about the show because she was caught up on pretty much everything Piers was talking about. Now, there were a few comments, not that many, but one or two, that said there's a third reason she might not need to ask him questions. It's because she lived it. This was her life, so she wouldn't need to ask for clarity. But that's an entirely different conversation. Keep in mind, Piers Morgan is talking about a TV show. Even if she lived it, she would have to know how it was represented in the TV show to have a conversation about it. Think about if somebody made a show or a movie about your life. In order to talk about that movie, you would still have to see it. Because even if you lived it, you would go, oh, did they do the thing in high school, my prom? How did they do that? You would still need clarity, even if you lived it. So although I completely agree that it's possible that there are certain elements of the actual story that she's familiar with because she lived it, that wouldn't translate to her knowing everything about the TV show, the way it was represented. She would still have to watch it to know how those elements were portrayed in the TV show, which is the only thing Piers Morgan is talking about. Finally, speaking of her seeing or not seeing the show, one of my friends who a lot of you are familiar with made an excellent point about her reaction to one of the scenes. Scott Rouse, the author of Understanding Body Language, one of the best books on the subject, could be found in two locations on YouTube. One is with the Behavior Panel for top of the game behavioral analysts who break down things in the news. And the other is his own channel, Scott Rouse, where he's putting out some amazing content, answering questions about body language, behavioral analysis. So head on over there, I'll leave a link in the description. You can ask him anything, and he's doing such a great job. Really good friend of mine, and he made such a great point about the Piers Morgan interview. It's about the moment where Fiona is being shown the courtroom scene from the TV show. Now keep in mind, she said she hasn't watched the TV show at all, and she's only heard about the courtroom scene and a few other things, etc. But they're showing her this scene now, which she's alleging she's never watched the show. And the point Scott made is, if you look at her face, there's zero curiosity, there's zero her taking it in. This is a show about her. You would think she would look at it like, oh, okay, that's what they did, or no, wait, that's not true. There's zero her taking, it doesn't seem like she's watching this for the first time and going, oh, okay, so this is how they portrayed me. There's none of that. She's just looking at the screen. It seems very familiar to her. That added to my theory that she's probably watched at least some of the show. I have a lot of other reasons why I think she's seen the show, all in the analysis, but that was a really great addition to that. And I think that she was being deceptive about it on the interview. And I think she was being deceptive about a lot of things on the interview. But I also think that when it comes to some stuff, we are seeing truths. All these developments that have happened since are making me more confident in my initial conclusion that a lot of the things that she's saying may not be true, but she's denying that court scene very specifically and very confidently. And it seems like now she's writing this letter that mentions specifically that scene. It seems like an MP is asking Netflix for evidence because it's claimed in the official letter that he sent to Netflix that no one in the news is able to find any evidence of her having gone to jail. And of course it's a little tricky because in the UK records are sealed, but someone, something, somewhere would be able to produce some kind of evidence. She's denying it. They're not really backing it up. It seems like Richard Gadd's statement kind of denied it being real, but not really. And even legally, it seems like we're in a gray area where if they can prove that a reasonable person would think that some of these claims were true, and I think there's a lot of things that are pointing in that direction, there might be a defamation case here. So I wanted to make this follow-up video to kind of talk about these developments because it seems to be going in a very interesting direction and to also address some of the stuff we're talking about in the comments. And thank you for your contributions, because there's a couple of things that were a little confusing to me that you certainly helped clear up. But let me know what you think about all this. Where do you think this is going? What do you think is likely to happen? And did any of this change your initial opinion on the interview after you saw the first analysis? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you on the next one.